Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for tuning into this episode of the OETV ESG interview series. I'm Sasha Chasen, here to bring you the best of OETV ESG today. And stay tuned, later we're interviewing Sandy Jayaraj, founder and CEO of Perspectrum Advisors. But first on OETV ESG. Check out the Daily Forecast's newest episode, Down with Greenwashing. Can blockchain help advance global commitments to emission goals? Chief Correspondent of Forecast News, Joel Flynn, and guest Dave Sander, co-founder and CEO of Alinfra, discuss the realities of global warming and how blockchain technology can play a critical role in boosting accountability, combating climate change, and tackling challenges of climate-related financial products, including green bonds and carbon markets. As always, this recap and so much more are available right now on OETV ESG. Now we're joined by founder and CEO of Perspectrum Advisors, Sandy Jayaraj. Sandy joins us with a 25-year career in financial markets, 4 years as COO and CEO, building a sustainability intelligence enterprise, as well as extensive journalism experience writing on emerging themes and sustainability for various publications. Currently, he's a columnist for The Sustainable Investor and Aluminum. Sandy is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and studied engineering and management studies at Queen's College. Sandy, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I'm very happy to be here.
I'd love to start out a little bit by digging into your education, your experience, your career, and how it's led to the founding of Perspectrum Advisors.
Sure. So I started off actually studying engineering at university, and I was sponsored by the Ministry of Defence in the UK. But on leaving university, I decided that I needed to get a business qualification. So I actually trained as a chartered accountant at Pricewaterhouse, now PwC. And that's where I spent almost 7 years in a number of roles, including audit, risk management and due diligence, and also learning and development. And it was actually a chance encounter with a friend of mine that led me to join Morgan Stanley, where I spent more than 18 years in both the London offices and also in Hong Kong, in a variety of roles. So I engaged both investors and corporates on ideas in the global media and technology industries as a sector specialist. I then moved to Hong Kong and created and managed the content development team for Morgan Stanley Asia, using pretty much the same skills that I learned as a sector specialist, but this time to help teams throughout the region engage with their clients on ideas generated from across Morgan Stanley in a coordinated way. So the ultimate aim there really was to monetize those ideas wherever they came from. Back in London, I then engaged European-based investors on Asia ideas, and my final role at Morgan Stanley involved me setting up and running a European quant sales team that had two goals. So first of all, helping quantitative investors understand fundamentals, and also help fundamental investors understand quantitative techniques and also what could be gained from alternative data sources. But then an opportunity came along to join Curation as COO originally from its founder, Nick Feingold. And so I moved on from Morgan Stanley to help him focus and scale the Curation business. Now, Curation's business was to help people deal with the information crisis. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's far too much content out there. People don't have the bandwidth to focus on everything they need to focus on. And Curation's mission really was to help them with that. But how much of a problem was that? Well, here's a chart from Statista showing the amount of data created per annum. And you can see from that chart, it's growing exponentially. But even in 2020, there were 130 exabytes of content created every day on average. Now, don't worry, I'll help you visualize that. This is my iPhone 12 mini. I got the 64 gig version. And so that 130 exabytes would actually fill 2 billion of my iPhones. So that's 2 billion iPhones worth of content is being generated every single day. So when I later became CEO of Curation, I sought to evolve how curation added value to its clients in managing all of that content, from pure curating to adding insightful commentary to then thinking laterally and joining the dots between sometimes disparate themes. And the ultimate aim really was to help people and organizations get to insights quicker. So I think, Sasha, you can see that from my time at PwC, through the various roles at Morgan Stanley, onto my time at Curation, there were a few common threads as to how I help my clients and colleagues. And I can really summarize those down into two things. So first of all, helping people understand sometimes complex topics in a simple, concise, and importantly, relevant way. And secondly, helping people think holistically and laterally to gain new perspectives and insights. So these are what I've taken forward along with the 25 years of finance and capital markets experience, enhanced by really 5 years of sustainability intelligence experience to Perspectrum, and ultimately, again, to enable people to make purposeful and sustainable decisions.
Thank you for walking us through that. I definitely see those threads you've mentioned, along with really utilizing alternative data sources as well as deducing and without disrupting the value of the content at hand, simplifying in a way that adds value and speed to the information you're providing. Really, that iPhone example you showed was shocking, and it does make me wonder. At Perspectrum, you mentioned, it's not about thinking outside the box. It's about aligning those many boxes across the spectrum to gain that right perspective. With that in mind, along with an information crisis we're dealing with, I'm curious how you really start to approach that properly within your services, and where do your clients really benefit the most from this strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. I mean, it's a very common problem that impacts everyone, regardless of what industry or activity they're doing. And with all that content, it is sometimes difficult to pull out what's important. And having that single perspective can create some problems of its own. But I'll illustrate one of the problems of having a single perspective with a small exercise. So here's an image that's coming up on the screen. I want you to take a look at this image. You should be able to see some splodges of color sort of dotted around. Don't worry, it should look a little out of focus, but I want you to keep staring at the screen. You'll notice there's a black dot towards the center. So start to focus on that. Keep looking at the black dot. So keep looking at the black dot. Don't worry about anything else. Just keep focusing on the black dot. Don't worry what I'm saying. Keep focusing on the black dot. And what I want you to do while you're still looking at the black dot, tell me what's happening to the splodges of color.
They're fading away.
They're fading away. Yeah. Now, this is something called the Troxler effect, or Troxler fading. And it demonstrates two things. First of all, much of what we see is actually in our brains. It's not really our eyes. Our eyes just gather information, but it's our brains that process what we see. And secondly, that we're really creatures adapted for change. It's an example of a neural adaptation, or in other words, the information in our periphery, those splodges of color, they're not changing. And so they start to disappear from our awareness. In other words, we sort of feel we know about them, and so we almost start to ignore them. And this is what can happen when we receive the same type of content, the same perspective, the same structure, the same way of thinking. And sustainability requires us to think beyond those traditional siloed industry and geographical lines. And this is really where changing our perspective can really help some of those insights, which frankly are hiding in plain sight. And in many cases, the knowledge is already there. We just need to be able to see it. So that's really what Perspectrum is all about. And I help my clients in two key ways. First way is providing strategic advice. So in some cases, helping businesses engage with sustainability for the first time, maybe don't know where to start. But in other cases, it's about helping businesses that are already engaged and already quite well engaged, but they want to be more effective. And that's where helping them find new perspectives can make that engagement relevant, material, and also impactful. So for example, I've been working with a biotech company to help them hone their sustainability strategy. They have a very good strategy, but I'm helping them focus it and helping them with their approach to communication by making connections between different themes around sustainability, but whilst also ensuring that they're relevant to their business and their stakeholders. Now, one way of thinking about how I approach that as an exercise is by looking at the high level principle and then lifting your head, turning it 90 degrees, and then applying it to a different geography or industry and asking, okay, now what? And that often triggers ideas, new thoughts, and new ways of thinking. The second main area where I offer help to my clients is through thought leadership. That can be bespoke project work, analysing a specific topic for them with a new perspective, or through the work that I do with the Sustainable Investor blog and Stephen Bowen, who I know has previously been a guest on your show, Sasha. The Sustainable Investor is aimed at anyone involved in investing decisions with a sustainability emphasis. So asset managers and asset owners, including family offices, investor relations teams, risk teams, and comm specialists, to name but a few. And in the articles that we write, we always try to make people think about a topic or a piece of news in a different way, challenging their thinking away from that traditional sector focus or geographical focus, and help them in that way find new opportunities and solutions or problems and risks that they need to think about, which is particularly important as an investor.
Right. I think your approach is fantastic and engaging and thought-provoking. And I love that you mentioned Stephen as well. He was a wonderful guest to have. And when I heard that you were collaborating on The Sustainable Investor, I was very excited to subscribe, and I encourage everyone here to do the same. I would like to dig in a little bit to one of the pieces you wrote titled Decarbonizing the Built Environment, the Simple and the Ancient. So that alone is very thought-provoking. I would love to chat a little bit about what really does the simple and ancient have to do with decarbonizing our world today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic. So I must confess, I think I scratched the surfaces, but hopefully, as you say, the article will provoke some deep thinking. I think there's a great quote from the cyberpunk author William Gibson. This was him quoting in an article for The Economist, and he said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And I think it highlights an important point. In our desire to find and roll out investable solutions, do we tend to look too much toward new technologies and ignore what we know already works? So yes, look, in many cases we do need new technologies, but sometimes it can be more a case of applying what we already know, just doing it much more widely. And sometimes this known technology has been around for a long time. And that's what really sort of spurred my interest in researching and writing this topic. And nowhere does this logic apply as aptly as in our built environment. Now, one issue is that these technologies and approaches often don't make for exciting reading in company results presentations or in broker research. And so the companies that implement them are often local rather than global mega businesses, and they don't often get the attention that they deserve from investors. So hopefully there'll be something new for your listeners and readers when they read this article. The sorts of things I discuss in the article include different approaches to concrete production, or more strictly cement making, the use of geothermal, especially for district heating, underfloor heating. And these are all technologies, believe it or not, understood really well by the Romans, the ancient Greeks, and actually much older civilizations. I also look at insulation, known about since medieval times, and retrofitting buildings rather than demolishing them and starting them again. So again, all simple and ancient solutions to some modern problems.
Right, and it's very sound logic. It's concrete logic. Just kidding. There was
very good
mentioned, but it is so clear that to look forward, you should reference the past. And it seems like it's lost more and more nowadays, especially in an age of information where there is just a surplus of directions to look. And while you were writing this, I'd love to know what key or even surprising discoveries you made throughout that research process.
Well, Sasha, I made hundreds of discoveries, but I know we're short for time. So let me just focus on four of the ancient ways of doing things and how those have translated into the modern world. So I'll look at four things. So first one is opus caementicium, or Roman concrete. The second one is Roman baths and also a commune in France called Chaudeguer. Third, we'll look at medieval tapestry. And finally, we'll look at Daikang, Ondol, and something called a hypercost. Don't worry, I will explain what these all mean. So first of all, if we look at opus caementicium, or Roman concrete, so here's a photo I took of the Pantheon in Rome on a holiday a few years ago. It's a great example of Roman concrete construction. Now, the height of the oculus, so that's the opening at the top of the photo where the sunlight's streaming in, that's 43 meters high. And it's also the diameter of the dome as well. So it's quite an impressive construction. But how durable is it? Well, the Pantheon was constructed almost 2,000 years ago, so pretty durable. Now, if we look at most construction today, most of it uses concrete, and it uses concrete with a pretty common formula. So aggregate, water, and something called Portland cement. And this is an important point. Opus caementicium did not contain Portland cement. It used volcanic ash and other ingredients. So what's the trouble with Portland cement? Well, there's a lot of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, that come from the process of making it, both from creating the heat to run it and also the chemical process itself. And there are a number of modern equivalents to opus caementicium that try and overcome these problems. So these include replacing Portland cement with microalgae-based cements, and also hemp-based concretes, all the way through to ways of absorbing CO2 by the concrete itself. But thinking laterally, another way of having less Portland cement in concrete is to actually use less concrete itself. So I also talk in the article about the ACORN project from Cambridge University, which is using computing, structural engineering, and robotics to design structures that use much less concrete. And here's an example of a vaulted floor that uses 75% less concrete than a traditional slab floor. Secondly, let's take a look at Roman and also Greek baths and the commune of Chaudeguer in France. They all used geothermal energy from hot springs and distributed that heat across a number of buildings. In the case of Chaudeguer, it was to houses and also the church. Now, today, we almost have a direct replica in the form of district heat networks. Now, that heat doesn't have to be from geothermal, but for example, fifth generation systems actually distribute heat at near ground temperatures, with individual buildings having their own heat pumps to then bring the heat or cool to the appropriate temperature for the apartment or office. And I discuss a number of examples in the article, including an extensive network in Stockholm. Now, thirdly, medieval tapestry. Now, I came across in my research Robin Pender. Now, Robin is a physicist specializing in the historic built environment, and she highlighted the use of wall hangings and fabrics in medieval times. Now, these wall hangings were more than just decorative. They were typically hung on hooks, making them removable. And she discovered that their purpose was actually to provide a radiant barrier between the humans in the room and the walls of the building, so thereby keeping more heat in. And in fact, Robin also discovered in research that buildings predating the Industrial Revolution were often designed to run passively using layout and those fabrics. And think about, in modern times, insulation, reflective and absorbent surfaces are clear examples of exactly that kind of thought process. And it's worth thinking about, because about 25% of heat loss goes through the roof of your building, and about 35% is lost through the walls. So I don't know, maybe we should all get some tapestries up, or at least get some more insulation in. Now, finally, Daikang, Ondol, and hypercost. Okay, so what on earth are they? Well, here we're heading right back to 5000 BC, Manchuria and Korea, where warm stones were used for space heating. The Romans then scaled this up to create what they called hypercausts, But essentially, these were forerunners to modern day underfloor heating that work at about half the temperature of radiators, or about 35 degrees C. So Sasha, you can see from all of these examples that this known technology has been around for a while, but is also applicable and investable today.
So Sandy, ultimately, how can the built environment serve as an important area of focus when it comes to sustainability investing?
Well, the built environment is a hugely important area in sustainability investing. I mean, it represents over 1/3 of global final energy use. It generates nearly 40% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, which in themselves are more than 3/4 of total greenhouse emissions. And it consumes about 40% of global raw materials. And with more than half of the world's population living in cities right now, but with that expected to rise to 2/3 of the population by 2050, there's going to be upward pressure on the built environment's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So a very important area, and I would argue one of the most important areas to focus on. Now, those emissions come in two forms. So you've got embodied emissions are created in extracting raw materials and converting them into a usable building or structure. So you remember that cement or concrete example we talked about earlier. And then there's operational. So operational is about the consumption of resources when you're actually using that building or structure. So you've got thermal regulation, keeping the building at the appropriate temperature, and also power. So what do I need to actually run the things in that building, like lighting, heating, etc. And reducing and eliminating wasted energy is a big source of decarbonisation in the built environment. So if we waste less, we'll consume less and we'll need to generate less. But it goes beyond that. So as well as the reduction in emissions upstream, this can also make buildings more cost effective to operate and maintain, and therefore making them more affordable and more inclusive. But there's two further considerations for investors. And this applies to the built environment. I think it applies more broadly too. The first one is how important how we frame a question is. There's an article I wrote for Illuminum which covers this point, entitled Language Timothy. Now, in the Northern Hemisphere, a built environment question that's often posed is, okay, how do we heat the home? Now, of course, in warmer climes, that translates into how do we cool the home? But with some of those extreme temperature swings we've seen recently, really it's a sort of how do we heat and cool the home? However, regardless of intent, that framing of how do we heat and cool pushes us towards a focus on the energy or the fuel source required. And indeed, a lot of focus has been on how do we replace natural gas boilers, in the Northern Hemisphere at least, with X, where X is either a heat pump or hydrogen or solar or wind, etc., etc., etc. And that, unfortunately, means that we ignore, or at least deprioritize, some other potential solutions to this problem. So how could we frame that question slightly differently? How does this sound? How do we enable people to keep their homes at an appropriate temperature efficiently? This is a much more open question. It encourages a more holistic thought process, and it brings in not only the energy source to vary the temperature, but also ways in which we can prevent that wastage, enable people through funding and resources, or indeed identify what appropriate temperature even means. So that brings in effective insulation, innovative building materials and design, and even consideration whether provision is local or distributed as well. Finally, it's important to think about transition as being as important as the end game. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when moving to more sustainable and greener ways of doing things or industrial processes, consideration needs to be given to how we get there. So something we're discussing actually in our weekly that's due out on Thursday, so you're getting a little bit of a preview here, is the impact of industrial revival, and particularly a project in the Teesside area of the north of England that may have actually resulted in the deaths of thousands of crabs. And also the benefits of sustainable self-sufficient cities that can also add to the local economies and still generate a return on investment. Also, the longer term issue of stranded assets is also very important, as what is often not considered is that one of those stranded assets is in fact people. Can they be retrained or reallocated? So there's a number of issues that need to be considered as well within that sustainable investing paradigm.
I'd like to move back a little bit and discuss an example you brought up earlier to help frame up a larger question. You did emphasize the benefits of Stockholm's extensive district heating infrastructure, whether it be saved energy costs or great environmental performance. And in relation to holistic construction, a holistic view of how we are utilizing energy, is there a financial edge to energy recycling or combining? And compared to the initial cost of building or any potential disruption factors, what are the investment nuances or opportunities or risks really being missed here?
Well, I feel I can talk about this particular topic with some personal experience. I'm lucky enough to live in a building, and it's where I am right now, that is actually supplied by a district heating network. And in the recent energy inflation environment, where many bills have risen multiple times, mine has risen by a little under 25%. And I've got hot water whenever I need it. In fact, I've not yet turned on my heating this year, but just haven't needed to. But looking at the opportunities and risks, as you suggested in your question, Sasha, there is disruption in installing a heat network, and really they're more suitable for urban areas. They don't necessarily need to be high-rise properties, but certainly with some sort of building concentration. The Stockholm network itself makes great use also of recovering excess heat from data centers, supermarkets, and other businesses. In fact, about 90% of the heat in that area is actually recovered and used through the district heating network. Now, in the UK, by comparison, there isn't the same regulation. And it's estimated, in fact, that waste heat that isn't recovered could actually be used to supply 14% of the hot water and heating demand in UK homes. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And then thinking slightly laterally, if we look at building cooling, there was some work done by Australian researchers where they developed a way to use rooftop PV or solar to run air conditioners to pre-cool residential and commercial buildings. Effectively, the scientists considered the thermal mass of buildings almost as a virtual battery that could be used to shift or shave peak demand caused by AC systems or HVAC systems. And actually, by using the surplus PV generation for solar, they can actually use cheap or free electricity to pre-cool the buildings, which consequently reduces their imports from the grid during peak or quite expensive hours. And a consideration here is, could actually predictive building control be used in a similar way to draw from the heat network during off-peak generating times to actually pre-cool or preheat those buildings?
Right, and I think this does tie into using the simple and the ancient to understand how we can work a bit smarter and not harder, which I think all of us could benefit from on an individual scale as well as a larger scale. I'd like to, include some of your latest publishments, or if you can give us a sneak peek like you were a bit earlier, for those who might be interested. I know I'm definitely very interested based off of just all of the questions that you've brought forward in just one article alone. So please, if you could.
Sure. Well, I'll flag 3 items that I've published recently and also give you a little bit of a sneak preview. So the first one is a primer on AMR, or antimicrobial resistance. It's perhaps the biggest macro threat alongside climate change, and so should be something that is at least on the radar of all investors or people involved in investing decisions. And there are plenty of ways to address antimicrobial resistance, from the biological, the physical, the behavioral, and funding and incentives perspective. And I describe all of these approaches, and I think it's a good way for people to get up the curve quite quickly. The second one is looking at underinvestment in water. Water is a critical resource, and I take a look at the recent Jackson, Mississippi water crisis and look at some ways to alleviate pressure on water infrastructure more broadly. And then finally, something entitled Why Wouldn't You?, which looks at timber as a sustainable building material, and also some considerations that you might not have thought of. And then just looking ahead, we talked quite a lot today, Sasha, about the simple and ancient in the building environment. I'm also going to write a blog on some newer technologies that will also help with the built environment. We'll also dive into some more of the details within antimicrobial resistance, and also just a look ahead at, I guess, a look at nudge theory, really, and looking at how some small changes can help with both the climate change issue, but also with health and well-being, with dietary change as well.
So Sandy, as we wrap up here, I do want to switch gears a little bit and ask, what ESG-centered trends are you anticipating with COP27 less than a week away?
Yeah, sure. And if I can just start by saying that despite the controversy, I think there's certainly some value in having a focal point, because even people not attending COP27, it does at least focus the globe on thinking about sustainability, whether they're there or not. But thinking about what some of the issues might be that could come from it, I think a key thing from COP26, in my view, was the improved prominence of biodiversity, and especially the link between climate change and biodiversity. And I think that will expand with COP27, along with more discussion about natural capital and agriculture. And I think they will play key parts. I've seen there's a number of discussions that will be taking place surrounding regenerative farming, for example, and also food waste, which is also a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. Also a topic we discuss in a future blog. I also think at COP27 there'll be more discussion on financing and funding. So from blended finance, where you combine philanthropy, government funding, grants, in conjunction with private capital. And I think that's important, because it also can help to align traditional fiduciary duty about generating a fair return with doing good. And alongside that, I think we'll see more discussion and nuancing of green bonds and sustainable finance, which have strong aims, but have obviously had some issues in the early stages. I think also what's important at events like COP and off COP, there's a off-Broadway experience equivalent, is in some of those fringe meetings and informal networking, where I think we're likely to see new and niche technologies discussed. For example, I think we're likely to see some really innovative storage solutions being aired, and also innovative generating solutions being aired as well. For example, something we've been looking at is aeromine wind turbines designed for rooftops. Well, okay, they're not really big wind turbines on roofs, but the technology draws wind in between two aerofoils. It's very similar to an airplane wing, and it creates a negative pressure that sucks the wind that's hitting the building through into an internal propeller on the bottom of the unit. It's undergoing trials at the moment, so it's one to watch. And it's a great fit with solar and batteries for local distributed energy, potentially. But it's also a link back to the simple and ancient. It's a sort of similar physical principle that wind catchers use to maintain temperature in ancient buildings. And these are very common across the ancient Middle East, Northern Africa and Persia. And that's obviously particularly given the location of COP27.
I do think that it's an important opportunity to focus globally, but also see where we can apply locally. I am excited for the results, and I want to thank you, Sandy, so much for your time today, for your insight. I know that many might be interested in speaking further, or want to subscribe to your work, or have some follow-up questions based off of this conversation. So what would be the best way to connect with you and your team?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed our discussion. Well, look, the main way to see how my team and my partners think and get a taste for the kind of work we do is to subscribe to the Sustainable Investor. You can come to the Perspectrum website, www.perspectrum.co.uk. There's a link there to the Sustainable Investor, and you can also read some other blogs that I've written for other publications in the blog section. And just a reminder, the Sustainable Investor comprises a free weekly email of interesting sustainability developments, but we always give a fresh perspective and a lateral angle. And behind the paywall, there are also a number of free-to-read articles too. The Simple and Ancient article is going to be one of those that you'll be able to read for free as well. And of course, you can also contact me directly at sandy@perspectrum.co.uk. And I'd be happy to find out more about your challenges and discuss how I can help you find those new perspectives to ultimately enhance your decision-making process.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you all for tuning into this episode of the OETV ESG interview series. We'll be back to view another exclusive interview, more one-of-a-kind ESG related research content, and of course, highlight the best of OETV ESG today. Until then, I'm Sasha Chasen. Mind your ESGs, take care, and stay safe.